I never expected my father to skip my wedding, yet that's exactly what happened. My parents divorced when I was 12, and we all tried to keep some semblance of normalcy. For a while, it seemed to work. He'd see me on weekends, we'd have family dinners on my birthday, and I clung to the hope that even though our family was split, my father would always be there when it truly mattered. Then, my mom remarried, and my stepdad became an unexpected pillar of support. Meanwhile, my older brother, Kyle, stayed under our father's influence, forging a strong bond over camping trips, fishing expeditions, and off-road adventures. I learned early on that my father was far more attentive to Kyle's hobbies than to anything going on in my life. Whenever I tried to share an achievement in school or mention a performance I was excited about, he'd show lukewarm interest at best. I kept telling myself that he was simply more outdoorsy, so maybe it was easier for him to connect with Kyle. But deep down, it hurt to see the imbalance. Over the years, I continued to hope that when a major milestone came along, he'd put me first just once. My wedding was the milestone I thought would bring us together. My fiancé, Jason, proposed to me in a sweet, intimate way, and soon after, we announced our engagement. My stepdad and mom were thrilled. They offered to help with anything we needed, picking out invitations, scouting venues, sampling cake. My father, by contrast, seemed uninterested. His first response to my engagement news was to mention Kyle's hiking trip. At the time, I brushed it off. I wanted to believe he just needed time to process. Little did I know how wrong I was. I sent out invitations months in advance, determined not to leave room for excuses. I texted him reminders about the date, told him how important it was for me to have him there, and even asked if he'd like to walk me down the aisle. He gave me half-hearted confirmations saying things like, "We'll see," or "Let me think about it." I tried not to let it bring me down. Instead, I channeled my energy into creating the wedding of my dreams. Then, 1 month before the big day, Kyle casually mentioned that he and Dad were leaving for a 5-day wilderness trek on the weekend of my wedding. My heart sank. I thought maybe they'd made a mistake, so I confronted my father, reminding him of the ceremony date. He responded with a short message that read, "I'm sorry, but Kyle and I have been looking forward to this trip for a long time. Congratulations on your marriage." That was it. No phone call, no explanation about why he chose that trip over my wedding. Nothing. I felt gutted. My stepdad offered to speak with him, but I refused. If my father couldn't see for himself how hurtful this was, I didn't want anyone else shaming him into it. The week before my wedding, I had one final call with him where he merely said, "Good luck." The emotional distance in his voice cut me to the core. I hung up and cried, realizing he wasn't coming. My father was choosing a camping trip over witnessing the moment I said, "I do." It felt like a permanent blow, a confirmation of all my worst fears about where I ranked in his priorities. Still, I tried not to let it ruin my wedding day. The wedding itself was everything I could have hoped for under the circumstances. My stepdad walked me down the aisle, his face shining with pride. I remember how steady his arm felt and how grateful I was to have someone who truly cared about me by my side. My mom was radiant, cheering me on from the front row. Jason looked teary-eyed, yet overjoyed as I approached. Everyone I loved was there, except my father. I won't pretend I didn't notice the empty seat we'd reserved for him. But once the music played and I saw my soon-to-be husband's face, my heart steadied. The ceremony was filled with personal vows, heartfelt speeches, and genuine laughter. When the official photos came back, I was relieved to see all the happiness captured. My bridesmaids helping me get ready, Jason and I dancing, my stepdad and me sharing a tender moment. I decided not to dwell on the fact that one person was missing. We shared those photos online, and my mom posted a few to her page, proudly announcing that her daughter was now married. People commented, congratulating us and asking questions about the celebration. A few relatives wondered where my father was, but we kept our answers vague, simply saying he had other plans. It still stung, but I wanted to focus on the joy of the day rather than the glaring absence. About 3 weeks later, when the wedding buzz had settled, my father left me a voicemail, sounding teary. He said he didn't realize how important the aisle moment was until he saw the photos. He asked if we could meet, adding that he wanted to talk. I didn't know what to expect, but I agreed. Part of me wanted to see if he'd actually apologize. We met at a small cafe near my apartment. He arrived looking anxious, eyes rimmed with sadness I'd never witnessed before. The moment he saw me, he tried to hug me, but I stepped back. He started by saying he regretted missing my wedding, that he never intended to hurt me. He claimed he'd thought my stepdad would handle it, as if it was a casual errand rather than the single most important walk of my life. Then, in a turn that nearly made me laugh out loud, he said he wanted a second ceremony. He wanted a chance to walk me down the aisle properly, to give me away. He pleaded that it didn't have to be big or expensive, just something for the family. I was stunned by his nerve. It felt like he was more concerned about not featuring in the wedding photos than about my feelings. I listened quietly, my anger building. When he finished, I told him there would be no second ceremony. My wedding was over. I was married. He'd missed his chance. He started crying, saying he felt shut out and that he realized too late how significant it all was. A small part of me empathized, but I remembered the text he'd sent, the way he'd casually brushed off my big day. I refused to let that memory fade, so I stood firm. I let him know that I was deeply hurt, and it wasn't something a do-over could fix. Then I walked out, leaving him at the table with tears in his eyes. If that sounds cold, so be it. I'd spent my entire life trying to accommodate him. It was time he faced the consequences of his choices. That was the day I decided I wasn't going to give him an easy way out. That first confrontation sparked my desire for a more deliberate form of revenge. I'd always been the one to bridge the gap, to chase after his attention. Now, I wanted him to understand, deeply and painfully, that I wasn't going to keep doing that. So I cut off the small gestures. No more casual updates, no more invitations to family events, no more mentions of my life milestones. My mother and stepdad respected my decision, and my mom made it clear to him that if he wanted information, he'd have to seek it out himself. Some relatives called me harsh, but others recognized that he'd finally gone too far. He kept calling, leaving voicemails, sometimes sounding desperate, sometimes offering gifts like a honeymoon upgrade. It was insulting that he thought I could be bought. I stopped answering those calls and only responded to texts when they were polite and acknowledged the reality that he had broken my trust. I also posted more photos from the wedding, many of them showing my stepdad beaming with pride as we danced or posed for family shots. My father had seen the earlier pictures, and he knew how central my stepdad had been to the day. Now, with each new post, he got another reminder of what he'd missed. I refused to mention my father's absence in the captions, keeping the tone positive. Let people do the math themselves. Over time, he became a ghost on social media, not commenting or reacting, but definitely lurking. The few times I allowed myself a glance at his profile, I saw him trying to do damage control, claiming he'd had a scheduling conflict or that there'd been a misunderstanding. Nobody was buying it, especially Kyle, who'd posted pictures from their camping trip that same weekend. The contrast was embarrassing for him. Then he showed up on my doorstep one day with a bouquet of flowers, looking contrite. I didn't let him in. I stood outside, shutting the door behind me, and listened to him beg for a chance to talk. He said he wanted to be part of my life, to be a grandfather someday if I ever had kids, to make up for all the neglect. He apologized repeatedly, insisting he hadn't realized how much I'd wanted him there. Those words infuriated me. How could anyone not realize their daughter wants them at her wedding? But I kept my composure. I told him actions speak louder than words. If he truly wanted to prove himself, it wouldn't be through a second ceremony or lavish gifts. It would be through consistent effort over time. Then he asked if we could at least schedule a family dinner just to talk things out in a calmer setting. I said no. My boundaries had been shattered enough. I told him I'd reach out when and if I was ready. He looked devastated, but I didn't budge. For once, I felt in control. As I closed the door, I felt the strangest mix of sadness and empowerment. Here was the father I'd once idolized, finally humbled, and I wasn't about to console him. Maybe some people would call me heartless, but I saw it as justice. After years of being an afterthought, I was no longer pandering to his ego. He had to live with the shame of missing my wedding and with the knowledge that his own daughter no longer viewed him as indispensable. That was my revenge, letting him marinate in the regret of his own choices without throwing him a lifeline. In the meantime, I focused on building a life with Jason. We settled into a comfortable routine, making a home out of our new place and enjoying our marriage. My stepdad and I became closer, bonding over the fact that he was the one who walked me down the aisle. He never tried to replace my father, but he didn't have to. He simply showed up, time and time again. My mother, always the peacekeeper, admitted she felt torn at times. She didn't like seeing my father so distressed, but she also understood that he'd made his bed. Kyle reached out to apologize, saying he felt guilty for not pushing Dad to postpone the trip. I told him I didn't blame him personally. It was Dad's decision to prioritize that outing over my wedding, not his. Kyle said he understood if I needed time to heal. He seemed genuine in his remorse, but he also couldn't rewrite what had happened. Through it all, my father kept trying. He sent me emails every few weeks, detailing how sorry he was, how he wanted to start fresh. He said he understood that the wedding was a missed opportunity, but he hoped we could salvage our relationship before it was too late. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let him wonder. Part of me wanted to see if he'd keep trying or if he'd give up the first time he didn't get an immediate reply. He continued to send messages, each one softer than the last, filled with more apologies and less self-justification. That consistency was the only thing that made me consider reopening the door, even a crack. But I wasn't done making him realize just how badly he'd hurt me. So I stayed silent, letting him twist in the wind. Over time, the calls from extended family urging me to have compassion slowed down. People saw that I was resolute. Some relatives tried to paint me as harsh, but my mother and stepdad defended me, explaining how my father had repeatedly sidelined me for years. Eventually, most people stopped pushing, realizing I wasn't in a forgiving mood. My father still told anyone who would listen that he hoped for a redo ceremony, some vow renewal where he could walk me down the aisle. Each time I heard about it, I felt my anger rekindle. The fact he kept harping on a second ceremony showed me he didn't grasp the root issue, the betrayal. It wasn't about a photo op or a single moment. It was about him choosing to leave me on my most important day. Trying to replicate a wedding to soothe his conscience was both insulting and selfish. My real wedding was perfect without him. I had the father figure I needed. I didn't need an encore. After several months, he seemed to accept there would be no do-over. His messages turned less theatrical, focusing instead on how he missed me and wanted to rebuild trust. He said he understood he'd have to prove himself with consistent actions. That was the first time I saw a glimmer of real insight. Maybe my revenge was working. By refusing to give him an easy out, I was forcing him to confront the fallout of his own neglect. In a twisted way, it felt satisfying. I wasn't cackling in a corner, but I felt vindicated. All my life, I'd tried to earn his attention. Now he was trying to earn mine, and I was making him work for it. That alone felt like closure in ways I never thought possible. Finally, I decided to write him a measured email. I thanked him for apologizing and for offering to be consistent. Then I told him that as far as I was concerned, forgiveness wouldn't be a single event. It would be a gradual process contingent on him showing genuine concern and respect for my life. I reiterated that I would never host a second wedding or vow renewal just to placate his regret. The wedding day had passed. My husband and I were happy. He needed to live with his choice. If he truly wanted to repair our bond, it would have to happen slowly and organically without forcing me into staged ceremonies. I kept the tone calm but firm. He replied a few days later, expressing understanding and a willingness to try. He didn't bring up the second ceremony again, which was a relief. I still felt a sense of power, knowing I was dictating the terms. Maybe some people would say I should open my heart more, but they haven't spent years feeling overshadowed by a sibling, unseen by a parent who was supposed to show unconditional love. For me, establishing these boundaries was the healthiest form of revenge. It wasn't about hurling insults or humiliating him publicly. It was about letting him see that I no longer needed or craved his validation. If he wanted a place in my life, he had to meet me on my terms. That, in itself, was a reversal of our entire relationship dynamic. Over time, I discovered that hurting him wasn't the primary goal anymore. I just wanted him to feel the magnitude of what he'd thrown away by skipping my wedding. And if he felt guilty, well, that guilt was earned. Where do things stand now? My father and I exchange occasional messages, mostly to check in. Sometimes he asks if we can meet for coffee, and sometimes I say yes. We keep it short, discussing surface-level topics, how my job is going, what Jason and I are up to. He's on his best behavior, never pushing for a second wedding anymore. We haven't reached a place of warmth or deep trust, but we're no longer strangers. I see this as the final stage of my revenge. I let him hover on the edge of my life, uncertain if he'll ever be fully welcomed back. I don't hate him. I don't even spend much time resenting him. But I will never forget that my stepdad was the one who walked me down the aisle. That moment belongs to us, and my father will never get it back. Sometimes I think about future milestones, like if I have a child someday. Will my father show up then, or will he be distracted by something else? The difference is, I no longer lie awake worrying about it. If he fails again, that's on him. My wedding taught me a lesson about who you can count on. My father was the one who taught me that lesson by choosing not to be there. No second ceremony will change that. I'm content with how everything turned out, and I've learned to keep my guard up around him. If that's revenge, so be it. I'd rather have this closeness than open myself up to another betrayal. I'd say I've found my peace. My father missed my wedding, and now he has to live with the fact that I've built a life without him at its center. He must accept that truth, and I am finally free.